Point of order, the Honourable Maurice Williamson.
Speaker, I wish to take issue with you, sir, when a member gets up and accuses members of our side, lays a charge of ecocide, and you're asking us to sit here and tolerate that, sir. I find that offensive.
No.
If it had been a non-controversial...
The member will be seated. I've asked members to restrain themselves. There was continual interjections. Now, under 64 and 62.4 in Speaker's rulings, interjections to be rare and reasonable. Rare and reasonable. Rare and reasonable. I have no problems with a robust debate. I think that's good for Parliament, but they're to be rare and reasonable. And what we have on the cross benches is that because people are in close proximity, we actually have interference with the microphones. Have the interjections been done from here? Different matter. I ask members just to understand that. I call the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, that speech from Kennedy Graham actually exposes the disservice that is done to the environmental movement by the Green Party. If we're to have a rational debate on these issues, it's vitally important that we actually do stick to the facts. The claim is made, hell on earth in a decade. Actually, the scientists in a decade's time predict that global temperatures are likely in a decade's time to be 0.3 of a degree higher than what they currently are. Now, remembering that the temperature varies every day here in New Zealand, which is a more mild climate, by as much as 10 or 15 degrees, it is a gross exaggeration to talk about hell on earth. And equally so with the completely over-the-top claims of ecocide and the like in the language that that member uses. Let's get down to earth and debate what this bill is about. And there are two important questions in this bill. Should we double the costs for manufacturers, for homeowners, on the 1st of January this year to step up New Zealand's climate change initiatives? And the second question is, should we include biological emissions in 6 weeks' time into the New Zealand emissions trading scheme? We are a government that campaigned on New Zealand doing its fair share. Is there any other country on the 1st of January that is going to double the costs of emissions trading on its core industries? Is there any country, Mr. Kennedy, in the world that's going to include biological emissions into their emissions trading scheme on the 1st of January next year? And the answer is not only not one, but there is not a single other country in the world that's even considering in the next 10 years of including biological emissions into their trading scheme. Mr. Speaker, this difficult issue of climate change is actually a balance between how much progress we wish to make as a nation in curbing our emissions down on that long-term challenge compared to what costs we're prepared to impose on our economy. And I firstly would point out that in the Ministry for the Environment report that was tabled in this Parliament last week showed that in contrast to the previous government, when emissions from New Zealand increased from 63 million tonnes a year up to 78 million tonnes per year, that in the 4 years of this government, emissions have come down. So my next challenge to Mr. Kennedy is this. If the John Key-led government, in reducing emissions, is guilty of ecocide, what would he charge the previous Helen Clark government that the Green Party propped up with, which did nothing in 8 years in this key area? But the further point I want to make is this. I have seen Labour and Green members repeatedly say, and not surprisingly with the job figures today of 7.3% unemployment, that this government should be totally focused on jobs. Well, can a member next say this? How will doubling the costs on every manufacturer in New Zealand of the emissions trading scheme on the 1st of January help protect jobs? How will doubling the costs of the emissions trading scheme for every manufacturer in New Zealand, and members opposite claim there is a crisis in manufacturing, how would doubling the cost there help jobs? And the second question I've got for them is this. Both the last Green member and repeatedly Labour members have said the biggest economic issue for New Zealand is its balance of payments. Well, let's just ask, what is New Zealand's biggest export industry? It's primary industry. It's agriculture. Well, can we ask the question, how do we increase exports by imposing an additional cost onto that primary exporting industry? The answer is you don't. The answer is that this bill is balanced, it's sensible, it's progressing our climate change policy, consistent with the promises that National has made, and that's why members on this side of the House are taking that sensible, responsible view, and we should progress this bill.
I call Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I take a call on behalf of New Zealand First on the Climate Change Response, Emissions Trading and Other Matters Amendment Bill. And once again, New Zealand First reasserts that we oppose any emissions trading scheme of any nature. We know that any such schemes are just basically Ponzi schemes around the world for others to make money at New Zealand's expense, at the expense of our corporations, at the expense of our companies, at the expense of our taxpayers, at the expense of the people, the men, women and children of New Zealand. Emissions trading schemes are all about other people getting rich from our money, and New Zealand First does not support it. We do not want to see people in Chicago, New York, Frankfurt and London and other places making money out of good taxes that are paid in New Zealand. What we want to see, New Zealand First wants to see, is proper attention to pollution and emissions within New Zealand and sorting out our own emissions problems within New Zealand and our own pollution problems within New Zealand. And if some of the money that was being taken in terms of all these carbon credits and all these various other levies were actually applied here in New Zealand, we certainly would see a far better outcome for our country and for our companies and for our people than paying to some offshore scheme that's gone from over $25 per unit and is now scraping the barrel at something like $1 per unit for the carbon credit taxes. And that's just shocking that New Zealand even got involved in such a scheme. And I could see that many years ago. I could see this 4 or 5 years ago when we were first negotiating these things, and I thought, goodness gracious me, we're going down this track again, getting involved in some Ponzi global scheme to appease other people sitting in other countries, and starting at $25, and lo and behold, earlier this year it had dropped to $10, then it dropped to $5, and in recent weeks we're hearing it's trading as low as $1. So basically what a waste of time the whole scheme is. This serves to turn environmental protection into a carbon credit bank to make environmentalism a speculative business. It's issuing tradable credits, is verging on a Ponzi scheme to give good money from some to pay for the wrongs of others. There are much better mechanisms for New Zealand than uncontrollable financial machinations such as emissions trading schemes. This will cost New Zealand more than $2 billion. An emissions trading scheme will cost New Zealand more than $2 billion. $2 billion which this country simply cannot afford. These funds should be retained in New Zealand in order to provide better funds to tackle our own pollution problems and emission problems here in this country, and helping to keep New Zealand 100% pure here in New Zealand. Not paying for somebody in China or India or some other country that's a bad polluter to get payments to rectify their problems. As we've seen so many times in the world figures, New Zealand is something like 0.001% of total emissions in the world, and our total emissions in one year are are about the same as less than 1 day of the emissions in China. So what impact would a little place like New Zealand have in that global environment when China in 1 day can produce more than we do in a whole year? And yet it is the likes of the Chinese and the Indians and other countries who will benefit from the scheme, because they will receive the payments to try and reduce their pollution. So we're paying for other countries and other organisations to get rich, while we, our taxpayers, get poorer. And it is disturbing, Mr. Speaker, that we're ignoring things such as here in New Zealand. I've written to the Associate Minister of Transport asking about emissions in terms of diesel emissions in our trucks and our buses. And we have buses that go back as far as Euro 1 buses, Euro 2 buses and trucks as well, that are still pouring a lot of diesel out here in this country, and yet we're not addressing issues such as that. And there are technologies available to address our own emissions in this country, but we ignore that, and letters that I've written to the Associate Minister basically come up with no solutions at all, and yet we pay into an emissions trading scheme. I would far rather see some of our good money going into sorting out, and perhaps some of our older trucks and our older fleet and our older buses being retrofitted to reduce our own emissions and our own pollution, and our own pollution in the likes of Lambton Quay or Queen Street or around Christchurch from our buses and trucks, then paying into some scheme where some guy in New York or Chicago or London is going to get rich from our taxes. The ETS does not decrease emissions, it just trades them and moves them around the economies that can afford to buy carbon credits. The ETS was devised by this government and it is unsustainable. It is nothing more than another tax on the people and production of New Zealand. New Zealand First is about proper solutions to solve our problems here within our country and not helping people in international markets to get richer. New Zealand opposes this bill or any other bill that proposes any forms of emission trading scheme.
I call David Bennett.